Welcome to the podcast. We do recover with Jared Miller, your host.
And I'm Dr. Terry Sellers, your co-host.
This is a podcast about recovery from addiction.
We want to talk about what successful recovery can look like.
Brought to you by Subs Recovery Center, Rise Up Subs, and the St. George Hilton Garden Inn.
Welcome to episode 152. I'm excited for today's episode, and I realize I say that on every episode. It's fine. I get excited for these things, man. Like, I look forward to it all week long. Today is a Wednesday, even better, right? It's like Thursday night NFL football for me. Like, I'm stoked because it's a Wednesday. This is before our typical recording time, so I'm super excited. The other part of that is I'm excited because I have Matthew Jackson here in the studio with me. This guy has got a PhD. He's got all kinds of education. He's a SUDC. He's I'll just let him tell. Obviously, this podcast is going to be with him in it, so I'll let him tell a little bit more about himself in a moment. But I just want to start right here, Matt. Is it okay if I call you Matt or you like Matthew?
No, either one's good.
I just wanted it to be proper.
Thanks, man.
So you have a last name Jackson.
Yeah.
Which I know a Jackson.
You should. If you're in the treatment industry and recovery, you should know.
But I know a Jackson real well. She goes by the name of Double J, Julie Jackson.
Jules, yeah.
How do you know Julie Jackson?
Oh gosh, Julie is one of my heroes, and really instrumental in getting me into treatment the last time, into recovery.
Said hundreds of thousands of people, I feel like.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. For her, absolutely. I mean, it's rare that I meet someone in the treatment world or in recovery that doesn't know her and have some sort of connection to her. But, yeah, she's
your sister, right?
She is my sister. Yeah, my younger sister. Thanks. And she's the one when I got to a point, and we can talk about how I got there, but I was homeless, penniless, and my siblings had helped me before when I had gone to jail and gotten out of jail, and they helped me get me back on my feet again. And this time, back in jail again, and they were like, "You can get some help, or you're on your own." Mm-hmm. And so, and she's the one that really recommended residential treatment. You know, in my addict brain, I was thinking, well, I got a tent, I can make this work.
I have safe and secure housing. I just got to pitch it first.
Right? It's gonna shower at but and working with the good folks there at Reflections in Linden is where I went the last time. But she said a couple of things to me. She said this about 8 years earlier when I was at the Pavilion in the hospital. Sort of a treatment center, but really just a detox place, extended detox I went to. She visited me there and said, "You really need to work the steps." And meaning, of course, the 12 steps of AA, and brought me a big book. And
nice.
I looked at it and I said, well, first of all, I'm not an alcoholic.
Sure.
I'm not even an addict, let alone an alcoholic, because alcohol was never my drug of choice. But
you had some denials back then.
Oh, just a little bit. And I I'm a little bit familiar with AA, but I read through the steps and I was like, I already know all of this, first of all. And it doesn't really apply to me because I'm not that person. I still have this very stereotypical idea of what an addict was, what an alcoholic was. And it wasn't me. I grew up with and had if you look at the protective and the risk factors that we look at, right, and people and their backgrounds and their likelihood to end up with a substance use disorder, I had almost all of the protective factors and almost none of the risk factors. And still ended up with severe substance use disorders, and we can talk through that a little bit more.
I was gonna say you're diving right into your story. I was just trying to tease you about your sister.
Well, she said to me the second time when I went to technically my third treatment center at Reflections, she said, "No one is too dumb to work the 12 steps. There are lots of people who are too smart to work the 12 steps. And that hit me hard because I, very, very used to having the ability to figure things out.
Yeah.
And being smart enough to manage most things in my life. Either manage them through, hard work or sheer willpower or through my intelligence. And I could not see a way out of my addiction. I just couldn't. And
you couldn't think your way out of it?
Geez.
That makes sense, right? Because like addiction's typically a coping mechanism of people that can't handle emotions and life events and things like that. So yeah, it makes sense. I got you. I was going more along the lines of like, let's get some dirt on Julie Jackson, right? Like any super embarrassing story. I'm just kidding. Please don't tell. I'll probably end up fired.
No, because she knows where I live. She can access.
I'll end up fired and you'll end up dead. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So this podcast is sponsored by the agency that me and Julie both work for, Steps Recovery Centers.
Yeah.
So we appreciate them sponsoring this podcast. Steps Recovery Centers is an adult substance abuse and mental health treatment provider. Steps Recovery Centers provides all levels of care. They have medical detox, multiple residential treatment centers, and outpatient services reaching from the top of Utah to the bottom. Recovery starts with you, and at Steps Recovery Centers, there is always hope. Call them today at 801-800-8142 or visit their website at stepsrc.com to learn more. Love those guys. We really appreciate them sponsoring this podcast.
Good people.
Yeah. So I also have a second sponsorship that it just dawned on me that I need to bring up here. Episode 152 is also sponsored by Rise Up Supplements. Rise Up Supplements is a nootropic line aimed at optimizing brain function and supporting mental health. They have two powerful blends. Mindful Mood helps decrease anxiety and enhance mood, while Mind Shift helps increase focus and optimize brain function. Place your order at riseupsubs.com. That's RISEUPS.com. Okay. Matt.
Yeah, man.
That was a good breath. That was good. That was a good somatic release right there. Let's start right here. So there's a lot we can talk about.
Yeah.
I mean, you're a smart guy. You got a PhD, right? You're a substance abuse counselor. You're working with the youth. You have a story of your own. Right before we started this thing, I thought to myself, where do I go? And I thought, I'm going to just start right here. We use the word recovery.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you?
Oh, man. Well, I guess I would start answering that by making a distinction between being sober or being abstinent, right?
Mm-hmm.
I stopped using drugs and alcohol. There came a point about 2 weeks into my last residential stay where I realized I could no longer live with drugs and alcohol. I had to get rid of them. And at that moment, that was abstinence for me, right?
So you realized that they were actually the problem,
right?
Part of the problem. They weren't the solution.
Okay? Right. And that was a huge realization for me, accepting that substance use disorder, in the 12-step world, calling myself an alcoholic or an addict, right? And just coming to the realization of what a wreck my life was and that I could no longer use those substances, any substances. That was huge. The next part, I guess, and this is where I get into starting to limb out what recovery might look like and how I would define it, is deciding, first of all, if I can live without substances, and then how to do that and how to manage that. Because that proposition for me was absolutely terrifying, and I think it is for most people in early recovery. That the idea of living life without substances to rely on to cope with life is something that's not only unknown, it's scary, right? And
for sure, you're talking about most people's number one coping skill.
Right. I mean, I had a pill for everything, right? And so at that point, that's when I was introduced to the 12 steps. And the 12 steps saved my life, no doubt. Right? a great sponsor who helped walk me through the steps and really got me into the spiritual aspect of that program, which is what it is. It is a process of psychic transformation or spiritual transformation.
Yeah.
Changing your whole being, right? The way that you live in the world, the way that you perceive, understand, and respond to the world. And after that, I ended up learning DBT when I started working at New Roads Behavioral Health. And DBT just dovetailed so nicely for me with the 12 steps. And that's where I learned really about emotion regulation and being mindful of my thoughts and emotions and really learning, we talk about one sign of recovery is the ability for someone to sit by themselves with their thoughts and emotions in a room all by themselves and be okay.
Yeah. Have some serenity.
Which, again, is that would have been impossible for me months before that. And what I think I can look back and see, not just in my own experience, but the experience of people I would identify as being, I don't want to use the word successful, that are really thriving in their recovery.
Okay.
I mean, you, my sister, lots of other people I know, that there's a point where you not only turn away from thinking about substances and that focus on not using, right? I'm not going to use today. I'm not going to use no matter what, whatever we tell ourselves. Just for today, I'm not going to use. And you shift from that and turn more towards, I'm going to embrace life and recovery, right? And really, in DBT and dialectical behavior therapy, we talk about building a life worth living, and really embracing that process with all the ups and downs and the pain that's still going to happen, all the problems that are still going to arise, and really building a program of recovery that enriches that and makes it fulfilling and meaningful and rewarding.
Yeah.
Right. That for me, if that's not happening every day, I am going to slip back and fall into old patterns and relapse. And so it's really, for me, recovery is about embracing recovery and building that life worth living, which for me has a very spiritual base to it.
Got you. I love that, man. Yeah, that's good. That's good. I like it. I just find it interesting because a lot of people, number one, I've had a lot of people say to me like, well, first of all, I don't really know. Nobody's asked me that. Which it's like, if we're all striving for this recovery thing, like, what does it mean?
We make so many
right?
assumptions that people just like, well, because when I first was in treatment, people were using.
But that's one of my favorite groups, by the way, is we talk about and we debate the difference between abstinence in either recovery or sobriety.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because to me, they're, well, not just to me, they're very different things. And so I always pose the question, are you abstinent or are you in recovery?
In recovery.
And what does that mean, right?
Yeah.
Good stuff. Thanks for sharing that with me.
Of course, man.
Yeah. Okay. This is a podcast about recovery from addiction, obviously. And that tells me most of my guests that come on here, not all, we've had some normal folk, but most of my guests that come on here have had some type of relatability in their own life.
Yeah.
You shared that you used to not believe that you were an addict or an alcoholic. Where did this idea that maybe you were in all this come from? Like, where does your story start? And keep in mind, like, share as much or as little as you're comfortable with. And I also want to talk about, like, you're down here for the conference and working in a new field for you. So I want to get to some of that, but share a little bit. Like, what does your journey look like?
Oh gosh. This gets to be quite extensive, so I'll give the short version.
The Reader's Digest version?
I think one thing that's important to highlight is when I first felt what I would call a drug-seeking behavior,
okay,
right? Which, looking at what we would call the genetic predisposition to addiction, that anyone can get addicted, but some of us just get there easier and faster than others, right? That we had this medicine in our house when I was young. I must have been, 10, 11, 12 years old. And it was called paregoric syrup, which was, I think they still prescribe it, but it was prescribed very commonly for upset stomach and diarrhea, and it had an opioid in it, which of course binds you up. And my mom gave me some of that, and of course it tasted nasty, but I remember the feeling I got when I took it. I was like, oh, this is good, you know.
The dopamine got released and your brain went bing.
It did.
Okay.
It did. And I would just go to the cupboard where it was and just, you know, take a pull off of the bottle.
Not for an upset tummy.
No, just to feel that
just
again.
to get the bing.
And I didn't process through it. I was like, oh, I mean, of course we didn't understand addiction the way we do now, but
When you were only 11 at the time, right? You weren't a deep thinker at 11, were you?
no. I mean, I was interested in baseball.
Baseball and tummy medicine.
Right. And yeah, but looking back, that was a very distinct, oh, that felt good. We want more of that, right? Which is what dopamine does. It's really more about the wanting than as much as it is the pleasure. But but then in you know, the summer of my 16th birthday, and again, looking back, I can see, you know, that while I was a pretty healthy, sort of typical kid, I did deal with some, what we'd now diagnose as some anxiety and some depression and some other things. And you know, we didn't talk about any of that back then. And part of that, I think, was just curiosity, maybe a little rebelliousness, you know, but tried some alcohol, some...
Is this like adolescent?
Yeah, so when I was
Teenage years?
15, 16,
Yeah.
found some cans of, you know, Schlitz beer that were warm. Maybe it was just boredom, I don't know. But tried that out, and of course, it, you know, didn't taste great. But then, of course, very quickly, most people who struggle with substance use can find other people who are up to the same things, right? And this is part of a somewhat typical teenage experience of experimenting with drugs and alcohol. And I found some of my friends who were also doing that, and we began drinking, and then some marijuana use followed closely after that. And where, you know, most of my friends would take it or leave it or maybe use it on the weekends, I was then very quickly becoming a daily user, right? And found people who wanted to do that too. But long story short, ended up in pretty severe addiction for about 4 years, and it expanded into some psychedelic use and cocaine and some other things. But ended up getting sober, clean and sober. I think in a way sort of worked a short modified version of the 12 steps on my own.
I was going to say, what year is this and what does treatment look like at that point?
So I went to treatment. Didn't even call it treatment. I went to the hospital.
Air quotes for everybody that is listening to this on a platform.
I mean, I grew up in Ephraim, Utah, right? And a small town, and so I just went away to the hospital. Came up to the Provo hospital, and
I don't want you to date yourself, but what year is this?
This would have been 1981. And spent 3 weeks there. And then, you know, it was very what we would now call therapy light. It's kind of cognitive, think good thoughts and focus on the positive and, you know, pay attention to what we now call the negativity bias. And you're going to be fine. And, of course, I relapsed the day after I got out. So, no, I don't know that as a teenager I was
couldn't wishful think it away?
As interested in recovery at that point anyway. But yeah, through the help with of some.
But to be fair, it also sounds like at the time, based on what you've already shared, at the time there wasn't like some acceptance around the fact that you had a problem with substances. It was just like, oh, I got to go get healthy.
Yeah, no, there was no talk about nothing.
There wasn't like any
that.
Brain disease stuff.
No, none of that was around.
Even if there was, it sounds like you were pretty much still in denial at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't even thinking in those terms. It was very much more, and yeah, that's a good question or clarification. And this is the way a lot of people still see substance use disorders, rather than it being a chronic relapsing brain disorder. That it was very much a moral failing, right? That it was a poor choice, a bad choice that I was deliberately seeking, right? which
We
jump
know
ahead,
now is, yeah. Okay.
comes into play later. But so yeah, I got sober, served a mission for the LDS Church.
Rad. Where did you go?
Ecuador. Yeah.
But that was a culture shock.
Just a little bit.
Going
Streets
from
of
Ephraim, Utah to
to
Ecuador?
Guayaquil, Ecuador.
What was
yeah.
that like?
Oh, it was a trip. I mean, literally and figuratively. Just so different from anything I'd ever experienced. And I gave myself fully over into that, and it was wonderful.
Nice.
And turned home, dated, got married, and some kids, sort of living, pretty
Human development pattern of life.
right,
Yeah.
and things going really well. And then some old and I'd say new character defects started to show up. Really had never. I mean, I was never. It's hard to explain this to, I think, especially younger generations, where we talk so much about anxiety and depression and thoughts and feelings and mental health and all of that now, that we just didn't talk about any of that. Even though my father's a psychologist, and we did maybe a little of that,
It wasn't like a norm like it is. It's become, I would even say nowadays, it's, right? Like, it's not a huge norm, but there's more awareness around it for
a
sure.
lot
these
more
days.
awareness.
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely still a lot of stigma surrounding it. Our keynote speaker at our conference today was talking about how, substance use disorders are still the most stigmatized mental health disorder.
Yeah, she was great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'd never learned to really notice and name my emotions, let alone try to regulate them and deal with them. What I found was, and this is sort of how my second phase of my addiction, my adult addiction, showed up, was using substances to do more good, right? So even with caffeine or other, amphetamines, I could use those to get more good stuff done. Was part of the rationalization that I had.
That was the story you were telling yourself.
Yeah. And, which would result in maybe some aches and pains. So I'd get an opioid to help relieve that. And pretty quickly I realized that, I could make some combinations, like cocktail of things that I could do a lot of really good stuff. And I got a lot of mileage out of that, like looking like the dad and the husband who did so much, that I was, working full-time, teaching, working on my PhD, remodeling the house, helping out with the kids, whatever else. I mean,
Sure,
we had a
that
lot
doesn't
going
sound
on.
like the lifestyle of an addict.
No, on the outside, it looked like I was just, I'm not going to say that on the air. I was doing really well with life, and I would hear about it, and so it really reinforced that behavior for me, and there was so much pressure I put on myself to measure up. And we hear this a lot in the addiction world, right? The fear of not measuring up, of not being enough, and
Feelings of inadequacy.
right, being possibly rejected or abandoned, things like that drive some of that, were really prevalent in my thinking. And then, of course, once you cross that threshold into severe substance use, or what we call it full-blown addiction, right? Then using to avoid withdrawals and using more substances or more of one to compensate for that.
Physical dependency set in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much you talk about that on here, but when the addiction works in the midbrain, right, and that pleasure center gets hijacked by the drug. For those who don't understand, for the normies out there who are listening in, the best analogy I have for what that craving feels like, if you've ever been in the water and come close to drowning,
Yeah.
right? And I've had a friend who really was drowning and had to, my buddy and I were out with him on the lake. This is when I was younger, but I mean, he was in full-blown survival mode. I went over to try to help him, and of course, the person drowning will do anything to stay alive, and he was trying to climb on top of me. He would have drowned me to keep himself alive.
Right.
And that's what that craving is like. When you are going through those withdrawals and your survival mechanism kicks in, you will do anything to survive.
Yeah.
I had
So we're gonna
I'll pick up there.
we're gonna take a short little break, have a little message from our sponsors, and then we will pick up right back where we left off with you, Matt. We'll chat with you guys right after this break.
You are listening to We Do Recover with Jared Miller and co-hosted by Dr. Terry Sellers. We'll be right back after this short break with more of We Do Recover with Jared Miller. Brought to you by Steps Recovery Center, Rise Up Subs in the St. George Hilton Garden Inn.
If you or your loved one is trapped in the cycle of addiction, there is a way out. At Steps Recovery Centers in Utah, we believe in second chances and new beginnings. Our evidence-based treatments, compassionate staff, and supportive community guide you on the path to recovery. It's time to reclaim your life. Take the first steps towards freedom, resilience, and a brighter tomorrow. Reach out to Steps Recovery Centers today. Recovery starts with you, and with Steps, there is always hope. Call us or visit our website to learn more.
We welcome you back to We Do Recover with Jared Miller, co-hosted by Dr. Terry Sellers. Brought to you by Steps Recovery Center, Rise Up Subs in the St. George Hilton Garden Inn. And now with part 2 of our podcast, Jared Miller and Dr. Terry Sellers.
Matt was on a roll right there. He brought us right up to the break. Dr. Terry Sellers is actually in Florida. I hope he's having a great time with his brother. He's going to a BYU game. If he's listening to this, love you, buddy. Hope you have a good time. Travel safe. So right before the break, Matt was doing a great job of kind of giving people who are unfamiliar with this an insight to what it's like to be craving, right? And we're going to get right back to that. So episode 152 is also sponsored by the Hilton Garden Inn. It is always sunny and bright at the Hilton Garden Inn. If you or your loved one are traveling through southern Utah and need a place to stay, just give them a Google search. Type in Hilton Garden Inn in St. George, Utah. They have amazing amenities. You will not regret it. Okay, Matt. So, the drowning. This is a good one. I use this analogy too, right? It's like your brain's telling you you're going to die if you don't have this, which it's not rational, but some thoughts aren't rational.
That's the point, right?
Yeah.
You've lost your rational thought.
The frontal cortex is closed up, right?
Right. And so this was, I was in the depth of my my addiction, and of course was doing some drug-seeking behavior with some different doctors. But went to this one doctor who's actually a nurse in the Navy, and she was talking through this with me. And I was telling her whatever I felt I needed to tell her to get her to prescribe me some more oxys or whatever, something.
Manipulation.
Oh,
101.
Yeah.
Okay.
But she got me to be a little vulnerable and maybe even a little insightful. And she said to me, and I'll never forget this and the way that it made me feel. She said, "This is like the breath of life for you." And I was like, "Yeah, it is. So give me what I need so I don't die." Right. And boy, that just stuck with me. I was like, "Oh, this is not good. This is like I need this to breathe." I mean, and that took me months, even maybe a couple more years for that to fully sink in. And I guess I want to highlight another aspect of how addiction works in that way to people who maybe don't understand it, because we talk about the difference between old ways of thinking, which some people still latch on to, that addiction is purely a bad choice, right? Or a moral failing. And that if somebody really wants to, they can change if they just try harder, if they really love their family or whatever else. And it's not that, I love the way that Dr. Kevin McCauley talks about this, that addiction is a disease of choice.
Right.
It's our ability to make good choices. It's not that we completely lose our ability to choose. It never fully goes away, but it's certainly diminished and weakened and distorted, right? And an example of that, I don't know that I've told this before. Oh, maybe I did, but I don't know that my son knows this. Maybe he'll listen to this for the first time. But I'd been put on Suboxone or buprenorphine a few times. Wonderful medication that saved my life probably a couple of times. Kept me from going to heroin. But in its initial form, it was an orange flavored tablet, if you remember that. But and I just had some in my drawer in my bathroom, which for me, easy access, so I could get it when I woke up in the morning and to avoid going through withdrawals. But my youngest boy, when he was probably 4, got into one of those and ingested it and started overdosing.
Oh, wow.
And this was a brand new medication. And we took him to the ER. They didn't know what to do. They're talking to experts, trying to figure it out. And so my son is in the hospital. He's possibly overdosing and dying because of a drug I'm using, right? And of course I love him. And of course I'm concerned about him and I want to be there and help him and whatever else. And I start going through withdrawals and my midbrain is saying, you need more. So I had to make up an excuse to go home to get more drug to deal with that. And that shows
It gives you an
me,
insight of what it's like in the mind.
right.
Yeah.
That it wasn't that all of those concerns and my values, that they completely disappeared, but they're overridden by that drive to survive.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, not a happy moment, but
So today,
yeah.
you're sitting here on is your recovery time significant to you? Is that something that you count? What does that kind of look like? And
Yeah, that's a good question. It's funny interesting. When I got clean and sober through the 12 steps and first started looking at working in the recovery field, I was a big book thumper. And the only way that you could get sober, at least in a meaningful way, lasting way, was through working the 12 steps.
because traditionally, rightfully so, right? Because traditionally, it's
still the most effective therapeutic modality out
Sure.
there.
Yeah.
As far as numbers of people that it has helped.
It started back in the 1930s, so there might
Right.
be a part of that too, right? But yeah, it's
And I think a divinely inspired program,
Yeah.
And I still participate in 12-step programs. And the one issue I have with that approach and that paradigm is I have my sobriety date of June 3rd, 2020, right? And my sobriety goes up and up and up. If I have a slip or lapse in that model, it goes all the way back down to zero. Right? And what comes with that? Shame. Right?
Yeah.
Which is part of what kept me in my addiction for years. The shame of being reliant on substances and the money all of the stuff that goes with it, right? And that shame then becomes this painful emotion that you need to deal with and escape and numb through more substance use. And what I've seen personally and professionally is that people who live and sometimes die by that model, that all or nothing, you're either all the way abstinent in recovery or you've slipped and lapsed and you're starting over. That can be a problem for some people. That they can't bear the thought of going back to their meeting and admitting a slip or lapse and starting their time over, right? And so one of the things I love about DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, is the approach to addiction and addiction recovery, which is much more of a harm reduction model of, it's like I use this with my students all the time, that I'm driving my sobriety truck down the road of life, right?
Okay.
I can drive all the way across the nation and never drive off the road. But if I do, if I start to swerve off the road, I can get right back on. And so looking at the reality that addiction is a chronic relapsing brain disease, right? We know
from
that,
a medical standpoint, that's the definition.
yeah, most people are going to have a slip or lapse, especially in their first year of recovery.
Oh, for sure. It's like an 80%
At least.
statistic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we track that, which we don't really well. But, even if we're half that, it's still a lot.
Significant.
Right? And to have a plan to get right back on the road to sobriety. You have a little slip, you hit those rumble strips on the side of the road, the warning, maybe you go off into the gravel a little bit, you can get right back on and commit to that full abstinence not lose everything, feel like you've lost everything. I mean, I can hear my sponsor arguing with me right now. That's not what the 12 steps are about, but that is a common sensibility in that paradigm. And so I draw on both of those traditions or therapies and more. I like whatever works to help keep people sober, go for it.
Yeah.
Right? There are many paths to recovery.
Well, and two, I think if somebody subscribes to the 12-step model, which again we've pointed out is a good model, it's worked for decades, almost 100 years coming up here in another decade. Like that's fantastic and that works. Interesting thought. So I hit 10 years this summer.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. And when I was at 19, so the year before that, Sellers, who's my co-host in this podcast, he hit like 20, and we went and we celebrated and we had a big to-do about it, right? And after all the guests had left and, you know, the night was kind of winding down and me and my wife were staying with him, I said, you know, how are you feeling? Like, what's it? And he said, I feel kind of silly. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, because everybody's telling me congratulations and it's been 20 years and I'm just doing what I could have been doing my whole life. Right. And so it was kind of an interesting insight. And then when I look at like Gabor Mate, I'm going to slaughter this, Gabor Mate.
Gabor Mate, yeah.
Gabor Mate, he talks about like, which aligns with my definition of recovery. Recovery is returning to whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wholeness. Sanity, yeah.
And so it's just an interesting, like if this is me today, and if I believe that I'm in recovery, I'm whole, like the time thing, anyways, it's just something.
Yeah, in some ways it's irrelevant, right?
Right.
And I know
what
people
I was
who don't keep track of their time.
The significant speaker up north in Salt Lake City area. I can see his face, and I'm drawing a blank. He doesn't count time at all.
Yeah.
It's the guy that wrote the book Recovered. Todd Sylvester.
Yeah.
Right?
I know about
he has
Todd.
that whole, like he doesn't. So anyways, just kind of some interesting thoughts.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, this just came to me as when you're saying, you know, Terry looking back, so this is what I could have or should have been doing, right? And I think that's a common trap for us it's one of the things I do with DBT and I pretty much do it every morning. I wake up and sometimes those thoughts about, well, I used to be this, I used to do that, I used to have this, and lost everything, and I'm still rebuilding. And so I practice the DBT concept of radical acceptance, of accepting my life as it is, being at peace with that. And in the AA, we would talk about everything being exactly as it should be. And it's kind of a Buddhist sentiment as well.
I like that.
And I guess what I would add to that is, I mean, I would like to think that I would somehow have arrived at the kind of peace of mind that I have now in my life, some other way than going through what I've been through. But I don't know that would be possible. Does that make sense? I'm grateful for it. I don't want to repeat it. I wouldn't wish it on anybody else. But I've come to the point where I'm grateful for everything I've experienced because it has brought me to a point where I have peace in mind in my life that I've never had before, right? And I think part of that is that process of spiritual renewal, that whether it's through the 12 steps or anything else, anyone I know who is in real recovery, as I would define it, and in long-term recovery, has a daily spiritual program of some kind that they work, however they define that. Some of them are agnostics. One of the most spiritual people I know is an atheist. But they work a spiritual program every day, and that's what keeps them firm in their recovery.
So, sounds like that was a big part of your recovery process, spiritual reconnection. What did that look like?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I was raised LDS, raised in the church, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
as they say in the AA book, most people return to the religion of their childhood.
Yeah, which I would say I have, but differently.
Let's get that. That sounds interesting.
It is. So, I mean, in my active adult addiction, I was going through the motions of being part of that religion, right, in this Utah culture. I mean, I was a professor at BYU, and
You were a professor at BYU.
I was.
Terry is missing out today. He would have
I
just
know.
loved you.
I'm so glad he's not here. No, sorry, Terry. We can talk about this later. Yeah, I mean, again, talk about having all of the protective factors and things going for me, right? I mean, I'm a good example of that addiction is no respecter of persons. It can happen to anyone, which is why I was so driven to try to understand how addiction really works, especially the neuroscience of it, to try to understand how something like that could have happened to someone like me.
And that's why sarcastically I said, well, that doesn't sound like the life of an addict.
Right.
Because it's,
Right.
it doesn't.
It doesn't. I mean, it ended
Terry
up.
was a doctor. You were a professor, right? Like, this thing can affect anybody. It
It-
doesn't discriminate.
No, it doesn't. I mean, I ended up looking like a typical addict. If I'd have kept going for another few weeks or months, homeless and penniless and whatever else. But
But I
yeah,
think that's
when
what people think of. They think of the
Absolutely.
negative consequences when somebody gets to that point as, from a social standpoint, the addict.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
the sad reality is there are people that are walking around with professional titles all over the place
Oh,
that have an
absolutely.
internal struggle, just like you
Yeah. And
described. And thank you for doing that.
are either in denial about it or are so
ashamed.
fearful and ashamed and yeah, they just don't know how to get help. Right? I mean, I was very much in that space for years. I knew that I was helpless and felt hopeless. I didn't know what to do. It's not that I didn't want to get better. I simply didn't know how.
Sorry, let's get back to the your spiritual component of your recovery.
Yeah. So going back to when I was, a couple of weeks into treatment, realizing that I couldn't live with drugs anymore, realizing that I had to give them up. I had no idea how I was going to do that. I'm very terrified of that thought.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I turned to the 12 steps and realized that the only way that I could be sober, not even thinking about what real recovery might look like at that point, but just to stay alive, that I needed help from a higher power. And I knew that I had been sort of separated from any real spiritual practice for years, even though I'd gone to church and whatever else, not living a very spiritual life for many years, and having to totally reconfigure that. And really, and this is what I would tell people who are thinking about recovery or in early recovery, is paying attention to your existential, experiential thoughts and feelings along the lines of spirituality. And what I mean by that is identifying and latching onto things that make you feel good that are not substances, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the most miraculous things, I think, in recovery, and you've seen this and experienced it yourself, I'm sure, is to go from being hopeless to being hopeful.
Yeah,
right? I mean,
absolutely.
that shift is so significant and miraculous, I think. And so I started paying attention to things like that. I later on started praying again and some other things, but just paying attention to what felt like peace or hope, or maybe not full joy, but something along that pointed that direction, or gratitude, all of those positive, healthy feelings that we identify with spirituality, and then building on that and really forming a connection with what I understood to be a higher power. And later on, my sponsor was like, well, do you pray? And I was like, kind of. He's like, on your knees? And I was like, well, no, I will now. and that's become an important part of my recovery. It's not, again, part of everyone's, but every day I do exercise, do some reading, some mindfulness, some meditation, all of those things that I count as being a part of my spiritual program, connecting with other people, doing some recovery 12-step stuff. I mean, of course, my work lends itself to that. If you do work in the treatment industry and you're in recovery, know that your job cannot be your program of recovery. I know
that's a
people
huge pitfall.
who relapse all the time because they rely on their employment to be their recovery program, and it just doesn't do the same kind of job. It can help out that way, but yeah, it can't be it.
It's
And
good.
so,
I like that. I also, so a couple things, right? A couple, first of all, for those of you that are listening to this, we didn't have sound effects that just kicked in. It's October and this room is blazing hot. We're in St. George, Utah, right? And
Well, hey, just a side note, nobody can hear the fan.
Okay.
Only you can.
Okay.
They have
I
no
just-
idea what you're talking about.
Okay. I just didn't want them to think we were trying to like turn on some, some sound effects of spirituality, like some breezy,
It is kind of a wooey discussion, though, right?
But you talked about like the positive things, like joy and some serenity, and also a big thing for me was like sometimes you find that in other places outside of like a traditional, what you would think, spiritual place.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this on this podcast. We've talked about the difference between religion and spirituality, but like I would say honestly for me, one of the first places I found it was in nature.
Nature has always been that place for me, and it is become more so. I don't get out as much as I would like, but boy, that's such a place to ground and connect and really center myself.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I also believe, again, we can each have our different thoughts, or me and your sponsor can have our different thoughts. I can pray like right now.
Yeah.
Like I
Absolutely.
really don't. Maybe, my higher power thinks I'm lazy, but I rarely hit my knees when I pray. It's typically like through a meditation type, right? Or sometimes
You
I'll
might
be
you might
driving
not have
down
the
the
pride
road.
and ego problems I do that require me to prostrate myself. But
So,
no,
but I
understand
feel
what
like
you're
that's
saying.
important for somebody who's new to recovery, right? That gets very turned off by the religious stuff. Like
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
talking about something very different. We're talking about spirituality,
Yeah,
which is an important part. Thank you for sharing that part of your process.
of course.
So today you're working in this field, which is awesome.
Yeah.
How is it you work with the youth, right? I mean, you were down here for the conference in Southern Utah. That's how this whole thing came about. You were available and I asked you to come on here. Talk to me about that. Like, is it different? What are the challenges with working with youth versus adults?
Yeah, good question. I started working at New Roads Behavioral Health with adults and then moved to the Phoenix. And then this opportunity came up and I wasn't really thinking about or wanting to work with the youth. But interestingly, when I was first in college, I was a psychology major. And my thought was that I would work part-time while I was in college as a psych tech at what was then, just early Provo Canyon.
Oh, okay.
Right? And working with teens because I had struggled as a teenager with addiction. I was like, oh, I'll go help them. And I ended up going to the English major. Anyway. And so it kind of felt like I'd come full circle back to working with youth. And I think one of the main differences in working with youth is that most of them have not experienced the negative consequences of their substance use that adults, that are 10 years into their drug use have experienced, whether that's jail time or loss of family, jobs, whatever else. And so I do a lot less, preaching's not the right word, and a lot more meeting them where they're at, talking about harm reduction. We're up against and working with teenagers, very powerful groups that are marketing these products. And if you're on social media ever and are interested in anything along the lines of substances, you're getting ads for cannabis and psychedelics. And not only is it not bad for you, it's good for you. They're healthy, right?
That's their pitch.
Yeah, and they're spending millions of dollars because they're making billions of dollars. And that's part of what we're up against. And I have kids who firmly believe that, that psychedelics are a path to spirituality, and that cannabis use is not harmful. And so we spend a lot of time doing psychoed around that and looking at, some real factual evidence, but it's a lot more meeting them where they're at, motivational
Well,
interviewing.
and real quick, I feel like there's so many levels to that conversation.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's a big difference between, in my opinion, between going to a provider who's going to give you a therapeutic dose and take you through an integrated
Right. Or
therapeutic process.
Even in indigenous cultures, right? That's part of maturing, and it's
Right.
you work with the
from buying it from Johnny on the street and just being the patient, the prescriber, the pharmacist, all at the same
Right,
time. Very
right.
different, very different.
So my favorite analogy here is actually from Anna Lemke in her book. Or maybe it's in a podcast, but she
Dopamine
wrote
Nation.
Dopamine Nation.
That's
right?
actually who I pulled up and was going to ask you about.
Oh,
And
I
was-
love her stuff. Yeah, read that book. I mean, it's a wonderful book. Warning that the first story in the book's about a guy who builds a masturbation machine. It
a little
highlights the
alarming.
problem. But she talks about spirituality and the use of psychedelics or any other drug, and that argument, right, that it gives me enlightenment to wanting to reach a peak of a mountain and getting there by taking the gondola. That's kind of like, well, taking drugs to get to the top. You can get there, but it's not going to last. It's not meaningful, as opposed to someone who walks that mountain step by step by step and earns that peace of mind or
Great
enlightenment or
analogy.
whatever.
Yeah,
I
great
love
analogy. So it's a lot of harm reduction, working with the kids.
that. Yeah. And just trying to have recovery ultimately be their idea. I mean, it has to with adults too, but much more so with kids.
So I went to one of the things that I went to today was treating the person in front of you, basically, and it was talking about like, individualized plans for people. And I made the comment, like, if I'm with somebody who their mind is made up that they're going to use cannabis again,
Yeah.
instead of fighting him on using cannabis again, I'm going to, like, what's your life going to look like before you make that decision? And how will you know when it gets to be excessive? What are
Right.
the negative consequences
And helping
look
them
like?
to use as safely as possible and having things in place that if things do get out of control, they're willing to.
And when I
a
shared
change.
that, you should have seen the room. It was like somebody sucked the oxygen out, right? Because,
Yeah,
but here's the thing: is that's truly right.
Yeah.
Treating the person in front of you. A man forced against his will is of his opinion still.
Oh,
you know?
they will double down and
Right.
I mean, it's like then I'm like their parent or their therapist or their church leader, whomever else is telling me the same
probation
thing.
officer.
Yeah.
It's good stuff,
Yeah.
man. This is fun.
Yeah, we'll have to do this again sometime.
Yeah, I appreciate you. Thanks for being willing to come down and jump on while you were in town. Hope you have safe travels back.
All right, thanks, man.
All right, we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you for joining us today on We Do Recover with Jared Miller.
Help us spread our message of hope. Like, comment, and share.
If you have any topics or ideas for future shows, please share that on our Facebook page.
That Facebook page is We Do Recover with Jared Miller. If you or a loved one needs help, please reach out to us. Again, thank you for listening.
Brought to you by Subs Recovery Center, Rise Up Subs, and the St. George Hilton Garden Inn. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of its sponsors. This has been a production from A Podcast Studio.